As the days turned into weeks, Chidinma's new life felt more like a prison than a paradise. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back at her. She had the finest clothes, lived in a lavish apartment, and had more money than she ever dreamed of, but her heart felt empty. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, her phone rang. It was Mrs. Ifeoma. Chidinma hesitated before answering, knowing that whatever Mrs. Ifeoma had to say would pull her deeper into the shadows. Chidinma, there's a gathering tonight, Mrs. Ifeoma's voice came through, smooth and commanding. I'll send a car to pick you up. Be ready. Chidinma knew she couldn't refuse. She had learned that the secret society was not something one could easily walk away from. And yet, each time she attended these gatherings, something in her soul ached, a silent scream that only she could hear. Yes, madam, she replied, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Hours later, the sleek black car arrived at her doorstep. Chidinma stepped inside, her mind racing with thoughts of what the night would bring. The gatherings were always filled with wealthy and powerful people, but they were also full of secrets, whispers of deals made in the dark, and favors exchanged that could ruin lives. When she arrived at Mrs. Ifeoma's mansion, the grand hall was already filled with people. Chidinma could feel the weight of the stairs as she entered the room, dressed in a stunning red gown that Mrs. Ifeoma had sent for her earlier. She moved through the crowd, her head held high, but her heart was heavy with doubt. "Oh, Chidinma, you're here," Mrs. Ifeoma greeted her with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes, something cold and calculating. "Come, I want you to meet someone." Chidinma followed Mrs. Ifeoma through the crowd until they reached a tall man standing by the window. His eyes were sharp, and his presence exuded power. Mrs. Ifeoma introduced him as Chief Nwosu, a man who had risen to great heights in politics and business, thanks to his connections within the secret society. "Chief Nwosu has been looking forward to meeting you, Chidinma," Mrs. Ifeoma said, her tone light but her words heavy with meaning. Chidinma offered a polite smile, unsure of what to say. She had learned by now that nothing in this world was given freely. If Chief Nwosu wanted to meet her, it was because he wanted something from her. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Chidinma said, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. Chief Nwosu nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long. "I've heard good things about you, Chidinma. You're a rising star." Chidinma's stomach churned. She didn't feel like a star, she felt like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. But she smiled politely, pretending to be grateful for the compliment. As the night went on, Chidinma found herself being introduced to more and more people, each one more powerful than the last. She smiled, made polite conversation, and played her part. But deep down, she felt like she was losing herself more with each passing moment. When the gathering finally ended, Mrs. Ifeoma pulled Chidinma aside. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice filled with approval. "Chief Nwosu was very impressed with you." Chidinma nodded, though she felt no sense of accomplishment. She wanted to ask Mrs. Ifeoma if this was what her life would be like forever, endless gatherings, favors exchanged, and secrets kept. But she already knew the answer. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Ifeoma stopped her. "There's something you need to understand, Chidinma," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "In this world, loyalty is everything. The moment you waver, the moment you start to question your place, is the moment you lose everything. Do you understand?" Chidinma met Mrs. Ifeoma's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, madam," she whispered, though deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. Weeks passed, and the weight of Chidinma's decisions began to press down on her. She had everything she had ever wanted: wealth, comfort, status, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something far more valuable: her soul. One night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Chidinma, it's me." "Adis," the voice on the other end whispered. Chidinma's heart skipped a beat. Adis was her childhood friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. They had grown up together in the same poor neighborhood, but while Chidinma had fallen into the secret society, Adis had chosen a different path. "Adis, how did you get my number?" Chidinma asked, her voice filled with surprise. "I heard things, Chidinma," Adis said, her voice urgent. "I know what's been happening to you. The secret code, it's dangerous. You need to get out before it's too late." Chidinma's breath caught in her throat. "Get out. I can't, they won't let me leave." "You don't have to live like this, Chidinma," Adis pleaded. "There's always a way out. You just have to be brave enough to take it." Chidinma's mind raced. Could she really escape the life she had fallen into? Could she leave behind the wealth, the power, and everything she had worked so hard to gain? But as Adis' words echoed in her mind, Chidinma realized that the life she had wasn't worth the price she was paying. "I don't know how, Adis," Chidinma whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know how to escape." "There's always a way, Chidinma," Adis said softly. "You just have to trust yourself." The next day, Chidinma knew what she had to do. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't continue to be a pawn in a game controlled by people like Mrs. Ifeoma and Chief Nwosu. It was time to reclaim her life. She went to Mrs. Ifeoma's mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived, Mrs. Ifeoma greeted her with the same warm smile as always. "Chidinma, what brings you here today?" she asked, her voice sweet but full of hidden danger. Chidinma took a deep breath, summoning all the courage she had. "I want out." Mrs. Ifeoma's smile faded. "Out," she repeated, her voice turning cold. "I can't do this anymore," Chidinma said, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to be a part of this world. I want my life back." Mrs. Ifeoma's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Chidinma saw the true darkness behind the woman's carefully crafted facade. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Mrs. Ifeoma hissed. "You're in too deep, Chidinma. There's no turning back now." But Chidinma stood her ground. "I don't care. I'd rather be poor and free than live like this." For a moment, the room was filled with tense silence. Then, Mrs. Ifeoma let out a low, dangerous laugh. "You're a fool if you think you can just leave. But if that's what you want, then fine. Go. But don't expect to come crawling back when the world turns its back on you." Chidinma turned and walked out of the mansion, her heart racing but her soul feeling lighter than it had in months. She had done it. She had finally taken back control of her life. As she stepped out into the bustling streets of Onitsha, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free.